Good evening, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. My name is Sydney Yeager, and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm so pleased to welcome you to today's program, When Nazis Came to Illinois, the History of the Skokie Case. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you so much for joining us today virtually. We hope, if you are able to, that you will visit the museum in person to see our new core exhibition, The Holocaust: What Hate Can Do, alongside our temporary exhibition, Survivors: Faces of Life After the Holocaust, from photographer Martin Scholler. You can learn more and find tickets on our website. We also appreciate the vital support of our members so much here at the museum. If you want to get closer to the museum and enjoy exclusive programs, member previews to exhibitions, and free admission, you can explore museum membership on our website or email membership@mjhnyc.org to learn more. Closed captions are available on today's program, and instructions on how to turn captions on or off will be posted in the chat, in addition to all the links I've mentioned. If you have questions for our speakers during the program, please put them in the Zoom Q&A box, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end of the hour. Today, we are honored to be joined by Arnie Bernstein and Dr. Philippa Strum. Arnie is the author of Swastika Nation, Fritz Kuhn and the Rise and Fall of the German-American Bund. He's written for Tablet, Aish, and the New York Journal of Books, and been interviewed about the German-American Bund by the New York Times, the Washington Post, National Geographic Channel, BBC and NPR Radio, and German public television. Arnie knows about the Skokie rally from personal experience, which we will get to. Philippa is Professor Emerita at the City University of New York, as well as the former Director of U.S. Studies at the Wilson Center in Washington. Her prize-winning books include When the Nazis Came to Skokie, Freedom for the Speech We Hate, and Louis D. Brandeis, Justice for the People. She was also the author of the founder of an organization that litigated and educated for civil liberties in Israel. Her most recent book is On Account of Sex, Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the Making of Gender Equality Law. I would also like to thank the Illinois Holocaust Museum for co-presenting today's program, and the ACLU for their help in putting the panel together. So thank you so much for joining us today. And now we're going to move into some questions. So Philippa, I want to start with you. Can you give us some background on the National Socialist Party of America, who they were, when the group started, and if you could clarify the relationship to other neo-Nazi groups in the United States?
Oh, sure. The National Socialist Party of America was organized in Chicago in the 1970s by a very strange gentleman named Frank Collin, who was very concerned with racial purity, which was the purpose of the National Socialist Party of America, to rid the country of racial impurity, which included Jews, Black people, anybody else he considered to be inappropriate. And it was a very small group. It understood that it was not going to have a huge influence, but that the influence that it could have would come from getting publicity. And it put itself into a neighborhood of Chicago that was full of people who were not very friendly to the very groups that this party wanted to get rid of, and the party decided that it wanted to hold a demonstration in Chicago. And without going into all of the weeds here, the city of Chicago made it impossible for the group to demonstrate in Chicago, at which point the group decided to send letters to all of the outlying suburbs saying that we're going to demonstrate in your city. Well, most of the suburbs just ignored the entire letter, but the village of Skokie did not. And the village of Skokie was home to 70,000 people, about whom 30,000 of whom were Jews. And of those, about 7,000 were Holocaust survivors and their families. And the population of Skokie got really upset at the thought of the Nazis, because these people in the National Socialist Party of America, I should add, marched or demonstrated in full Nazi regalia. They were upset, the Skokie people were upset about that idea. And the village of Skokie immediately said, well, we will require a $350,000 liability insurance policy before we let you into our town. There was no way in the world this little group had that amount of money, nor would any insurance company come up with it. And I might add that Chicago also had told them that there would be a $300,000 dollar requirement if they were going to demonstrate in Chicago. A requirement, by the way, that in Chicago affected the Martin Luther King Jr. coalition exactly the same way it affected the National Socialist Party of America's. No group was allowed to demonstrate without posting this bond. Well, the case became a major one. Colin and the party went to the ACLU of Illinois to ask for representation on the grounds that this was simply a matter of free speech. They had said to Skokie and to the other places, we want to come demonstrate. It will be a peaceful demonstration. We want to have the equivalent of a picket line in front of your town hall. We will carry signs, but we will not be chanting or otherwise speechifying. And the ACLU agreed that this would be a violation of the First Amendment's protection of freedom of speech, which allows people to demonstrate freely. I mean, for those of you who are outside of the United States, and perhaps for some of you who are inside the United States as well, the First Amendment to the American Constitution says that no government entity can abridge the freedom of speech or the right of the people peacefully to assemble. And that's what this group said they were doing. They were going to carry obnoxious signs. They were going to march in their uniforms, but they said, this is all free speech. And as was indicated by the fact that the Chicago requirement, like the Skokie requirement, would have kept the Martin Luther King Jr. coalition from demonstrating, the ACLU felt this was a really dangerous kind of regulation and that it had to be fought because it could be used by a government against any group that wanted to assemble peacefully and exercise its right to speech.
Thank you. Yeah, so thank you for that overview. And we'll kind of get more into what you just gave us an overview about a bit later. So Arnie, you grew up in Skokie, you know, that's kind of the connection that we hinted at.
Right. I went to high school in Skokie, just to be clear. I grew up in Niles and then Morton Grove, and I went to Niles West High School in Skokie.
So can you tell us what Skokie was like before all of this, you know, and especially maybe about the population of Holocaust survivors living there? You know, what was it like? What was the town like, you know, just on a day-to-day basis?
Normal. It was just, you know, your normal northern suburb. Now, more synagogues perhaps than, you know, other suburbs. But it was a nice area. I do, though, remember in the midst of all this, I worked at Towelboy or something at this local swimming pool. And I remember a guy, you know, handing him a towel and he had the little number on his arm. It wasn't talked about much, the Holocaust at all, which, you know, if anything, this really opened up Holocaust education in Illinois and elsewhere. But as I recall, we didn't talk about it much.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So, Philippa, as you said earlier, Frank Collin, who is the head of the National Socialist Party of America, asked permission to hold a demonstration in front of Skokie's town hall. So this is actually a bit different, I think, than the narrative that we hear, which is that they wanted to be a march through Skokie. It wasn't just in one place. So I know you kind of talked a bit about what they were requesting, but could you just go into a bit more detail about what exactly, like how long this was supposed to last? What exactly was the permit that they were requesting?
They were just asking for a permit that would last for 30 minutes. And then they presumably would disband and all go home. I think it's important to know why the story has become that they wanted to march through Skokie and what that would have meant. Obviously, for Holocaust survivors to see people in Nazi uniforms with signs saying Jews go home or whatever, what they really wanted to say, and with the swastika as part of their uniform, it would have been very traumatic. And so that's not what the party asked for. But eventually, when the case did go to trial, because the ACLU brought a case saying that they should be allowed to demonstrate, the judge in the case used the word march, and the media immediately picked up that word, and that immediately, as I say, became the orthodox, if you will, story of Skokie, that they wanted to march through. And certainly the fact that many people believe that that's what they had asked for helped to generate much of the opposition to the demonstration itself.
Thank you. So Arnie, I would say usually when a group files a request for a march or something, it doesn't really, most people probably don't hear about it if it's rejected or if it's accepted. So how and when did the community first hear about this request? And, I would imagine probably the initial reaction is anger and upset, but what was that initial reaction like?
Boy, it was all over the place, as I recall. People were for it. People were against it. Freedom of speech issue was a lot. It was a fairly liberal community, and you have the right to be obnoxious was one hand. On the other hand, we can't have these people marching through our town. It's it first of all, it would upset the Holocaust survivors, which is understandable. There were arguments, as I say, both for, against. Some arguments were that they could come in and march, and everybody said march. I mean, that was just a given. That I had never heard that one, Philippa. That's interesting, because it was a march, but they were prevailing. I don't want to say prevailing, but there were some that said no, don't let them in, and others said, you know what, in Berlin we didn't have the right to talk back. Here we have the right to talk back, and believe me, there were a lot of people who wanted to talk back. It was an intense time.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Didn't mean to interrupt you, Arnie. I thought you were finished. Sorry.
No, yeah.
I just wanted to add to that, the first reaction of the government of Skokie actually was to quarantine, so that they asked the people of Skokie not to come out at all on the assumption that the demonstration would take place, but to pay no attention, which would deprive the party of exactly what it wanted, which was a lot of attention, a lot of publicity. And it was only shortly thereafter, when more and more people in the village started to hear about this, that they decided, no, they couldn't do that. They had to react.
So Arnie, was there kind of talk about maybe organizing if this had gone through, was there any talk about organizing a counter demonstration, anything like that? I know you were in high school, but
yeah, it was beyond counter demonstration. People were in many cases quite eager for them to come in. I was at the village hall the day they were supposed to come in, and just to give the visual, people were ready. They couldn't wait for them to come there. And it was crowded. There were people with signs. There were a few baseball bats. It was a time. They were, everybody was talking about it, in school. I remember they staying outside the Skokie Theater, the movie theater, which actually was not far from the village hall, maybe a block or two. They were showing the movie Julia, about Lillian Hellman and how she helps her friend Julia get out of Germany. Well, it was Vanessa Redgrave who had made that pro-Palestinian speech at the Oscars. And there were some guys outside the theaters. We were waiting to go in. They told us they were from the Jewish Defense League. And they were there to help look out for the people of Skokie, and they gave, my friends and I some of their pamphlets and some of their application forms, and do you know how to karate, and do you know how to operate a submachine gun, things like that. It was, I think they were more, they were just more, more all sizzle no steak kind of thing. And they wanted to, inspire, a counter fear and, a counter reaction to Nazis coming in. I don't know anyone joined the JDL as a result of that. They did say they were going to let mice loose too in the Skokie Theater when that film was shown, but that never happened either.
Oh, gotcha. Okay, thank you for that. And just to clarify a question that just came in that I do just want to clarify, I know that the year was 1977 when this was happening, but do either of you know the month that the march was planned for? I don't remember off the top of my head.
I don't remember off the top of my head, but it was actually 1976, and
Oh, I'm sorry.
the case was finally resolved in 1977.
Right. And slightly amusing, such as this can be, there were various dates that were proposed, one of which was April 20th, which was Hitler's birthday, also my birthday, interestingly enough. So, and I mean, for my birthday party that year, we, I sent my friends pictures of invitations of Bozo the Clown with a swastika on his arm, because we were making fun of it too. Kids were singing Springtime for Hitler from the producers. The younger people were making fun and laughing about it. They were a bunch of, they weren't Nazis, they were a bunch of mopes when you looked at it, and who put on their little brown uniforms and marched around and thought they had importance.
So Philippa, kind of as you hinted, you told us before that there was a lawsuit as a result of this. And so this is where the ACLU kind of starts to enter the story. So can you tell us what the ACLU is, how they started, and kind of why they were the kind of the organization that the Nazis went to represent them?
Sure. The American Civil Liberties Union, ACLU, was founded in 1920, and the genesis was largely to protect pacifists during the First World War who were speaking out against the war. And so the protection of free speech became a core principle of the ACLU, although its mandate was larger than that. And of course, today, the ACLU protects the full range of rights in the United States, and emphasizes not only freedom of speech and press and assembly, but fair jury trials, racial equality, as I say, the full range of rights. And gradually, over the decades, while the ACLU started in New York City as a relatively small group of people, it expanded across the country and now has what we call affiliates in all of the states of the United States. The Illinois affiliate was one of those, was and is one of those. And so when a case is about when there's a situation on a local level, the logical thing for people who are concerned is to go to the local affiliate. And that's what Frank Holland did. And what he encountered there was a wonderful lawyer named David Goldberger, who, and I think this bears emphasis, who was and is Jewish, as the then executive director of the ACLU was Jewish. And in fact, R.A. Nair had been a refugee from the National ACLU, had been a refugee from Germany himself. So they fully understood what the Nazis stood for. But again, they simply felt that it was absolutely crucial to defend the right of free speech. And the reason I should add were reasons that were set down by that time, were very well established in American constitutional law. The whole question is, I suppose, why should we allow people with really obnoxious, thoroughly unacceptable ideas to have freedom of speech, to be able to assemble peacefully when it is so obnoxious? And if I may just jump in here with a quote from one of the great Supreme Court justices in the United States, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said this in 1929, so right after the First World War. And he said, if there is any principle of the Constitution that more imperatively calls for attachment than any other, it is the principle of free thought. Not free thought for those who agree with us, but freedom for the thought that we hate. And what he meant by that was, sure, we can all stand up for the people who agree with us, but we need to stand up for the others as well. And another major Supreme Court justice, a Jew, the first Jew to sit on the Supreme Court, Louis Dembitz Brandeis, had said that the reason we have to have speech in the United States is that this is a democracy, which means the people rule. How are the people going to know how to rule if they don't have access to all possible ideas? How are they going to know which ideas are right, which ones they think are wrong? And he added, the worst group to make that decision for the people would be the government, because those in power, of course, always have some interest in stifling the views of the people who disagree with them. And so if we want to talk about why we need speech in the United States, we need it because it is the basis of democracy. But if we want to talk about why the government should not be allowed to decide who speaks, well, that becomes obvious. We want the people who oppose governmental policies to be able to speak, as well as those who like those policies.
Thank you. Can you tell us what exactly the initial case, kind of the initial lawsuit that's filed in the lower courts in Illinois, what exactly were they suing for, and what's the result of that initial case?
Well, there was a whole bunch of cases gradually, and they all became known as the Skokie case. And again, we don't want to get too much into the weeds here, but basically the case was asking simply to stop the village of Skokie to prevent the party from marching. Initially, it was to say that this requirement of $350,000 as an insurance bond was unconstitutional because it's what in the United States is called a prior restraint on speech, stopping speech before it has a right to happen. After that, the village of Skokie passed a number of ordinances that would have kept anybody with uniforms from demonstrating, a whole bunch of things. So gradually, the cases became an attempt to negate all of those new regulations and new laws.
Thank you. And so, Arnie, I'm assuming probably at this point you all had heard that the ACLU is representing Nazis, and also that David Goldberger, as Philippa mentioned, is representing them. So what were you all thinking at this time? What was their
again, opinions were all over the place. You know, and they could change from day to day to hour what people would be thinking, myself included. You know, and we would, you know, I have friends, we would debate it back and forth. You know, I can't speak for everybody, but I know with you know, many of my friends, we were joking about them, you know, because they were foolish, they were mopes, and we would laugh about them. But beneath the laughter is these dead serious issues, these, you know, these people who would survive. And keep in mind too, people weren't talking about what had happened to them. This was time people still were not talking that much about what had happened. And it was upsetting to many people. It was bringing up memories they wanted to keep in, you know, locked up in their brain. That would then, you know, I think with the older, you know, the older crowd, it was they weren't laughing like, you know, the teenagers were laughing. And when I say that, I'm speaking for my group specifically. I'm not speaking for everybody. But it really tore a lot apart as far as, you know, in public discourse. You know, people were hardcore, no, they can't come in. People were hardcore, it's freedom of speech issue. I kind of felt personally in between the two, because it is a freedom of speech issue. And when you bring up that uniform thing, Philippa, I remember, you know, the argument is, well, the Boy Scouts can't march now. The Boy Scouts can't, you know, hold a, you know, camporee or something on the village steps or something. It was really all over the place. And it was, you know, I mean, we made light of it, you know, but it was also scary because, you know, are these people just limited to this, you know, little band of people coming from Marquette Park in Chicago, which is the other side of the city? Do they have allies somewhere? I remember when this was maybe a year or two before it happened, I found a little pamphlet in the street, and it said, we are coming, we're going to be putting up a lovely poster of rabbis committing ritual killing of Gentile children and using their blood to make matzah, and it will be on this beautiful glue that cannot be, taken off, and we'll be putting on lampposts and things like that. Scared the hell out of me, this little pamphlet. And, I was, maybe what, 14, 15. And it really frightened me because I didn't, I found it in the street. Who knows who had been, was it a neighbor? Was it somebody who'd been driving by and just tossed it out of their car? You didn't know. Like I say, it was all over the place. It was, one day you'd be laughing, the next day you'd be terrified.
May I just add that it wasn't just the Jews, or many of the Jews of Skokie, who were upset at the idea of the demonstration. The mayor of Skokie was not Jewish.
Yeah.
But he was very, very sympathetic to the Holocaust survivors. And many of the people in his cabinet felt exactly the same way. And so eventually it was he who told the village attorney to fight in court, to fight the attempt of these people to demonstrate. So it cut across all religions, if you will.
Right. He was considered a heroic figure for his willingness to stand up to Nazis. You wonder, where were these people in Berlin, kind of thing. And they were, as I recall, the mayor and the administration were held in very high regard by the Jewish community for what they were doing.
So this is really, an issue and a topic that's really, it sounds like, not just affecting the Jewish community. People are talking about it, no matter, who they are in Skokie. Okay, so that's good to know as well. So, as we said, this case goes through a number of lower court cases, which we, won't get into, but Philippa kind of gave us the result of all those. And eventually it gets to the United States Supreme Court, which is probably how many people know about it at this point. So, Arnie, can you tell us, it's starting to get nationwide attention. Can you tell us, and Philippa told us a bit about how the press was talking about this case, but can you give us a little bit more detail about what the media is looking like, in Skokie and nation?
Right. It kind of set the template for some of the media circuses we see today. People were coming in. It was a national story. It was made the national news. This is pre-internet too. So pre-Twitter, pre-TikTok, and we were getting people from all over. As I recall, there was some, foreign press as well. They're, talking to people. But when I say press, both TV journalism, radio journalism, and print journalism. And in some ways, a lot of people felt that it reached the height that it did because of this media attention. Colin loved it. He really learned how to play the press. And he really did play the press. He was always giving press conferences. They would show up. He was good for a soundbite. Before the word soundbite existed, he knew how to manipulate the press. And they, they had their vacuum they need filled. And so they would keep the cameras trained on him. They would quote him. It was remarkable. And I think part of why it became so big is because of that media response. Not that I'm knocking the media, you need to, report on these things, but it became, the proverbial media circus. And Colin knew what he was doing. He was very good at playing.
Yeah, and it hit not only the United States, but newspapers all over the world started to pick it up. So that this really became an international cause célèbre. It wasn't just Skokie anymore.
And Philippa, was the ACLU expecting such a large media response, or did they think this would probably not get as much attention? Was the ACLU prepared for that kind of response?
Well, the man who was the president of the ACLU affiliate in Illinois at the time warned David Goldberger that this was going to be a huge case, and David Goldberger poo-pooed it and said, no, it's so straightforward. It's a First Amendment case. But yeah, it became a huge thing. And actually, in large part because of media coverage, the ACLU lost thousands of its members over the case. Although
yeah.
I will say that a couple of political scientists have looked at the reason for that and have said that it wasn't just the people who left had not really been hardcore, if you will, civil libertarians in the first place. Many of them had joined the ACLU when it became the first national organization to call for the impeachment of President Nixon. And so they weren't really into First Amendment or other rights. And so it was easy for them to leave. But it meant a financial hit for the organization, no question about it. And as I say, a lot of that was media related because relatively few people across the United States truly understood what the case was all about, in part because they really thought that it was a matter of people in Nazi uniforms marching right onto the porches of Holocaust survivors in Skokie. And that is actually the way it was portrayed in much of the media.
Yeah. Yeah. And as I said, people didn't talk about it, and suddenly people were now starting to talk about it. As I mean, we didn't have Holocaust education at the time. And they gave us, I remember this very clearly, they gave us a survey asking, do you know who, for example, Himmler or Goebbels was? Do you know the number of Jews that were killed, you know, et cetera, you know, what was Terezin, what was Auschwitz? And it was just a general survey, I think, that was put out by the state of Illinois. I remember taking this in a class, and that led to a broader Holocaust education, and ultimately became, mandated by law in Illinois to have Holocaust education. That was one of the outgrowths of this thing.
And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, but I do want to ask, so the Supreme Court case, once it gets to the Supreme Court, and I thought that this was unusual, but Philippa, please correct me if I'm wrong, the court makes a decision based only on the briefs that are filed by each side. They don't hear oral arguments. So is this unusual, and why did the court decide that they didn't need to hear oral arguments? Was it because they also felt it was as straightforward as David Goldberger did, or was there other reasons?
Well, what the Supreme Court was actually asked to do was direct a lower court to make a decision about it. The lower courts were stalling, basically, and a First Amendment right was implicated. And so all the Supreme Court did, it did not make any decision on the merits or anything of that kind, but simply said to the lower courts, you have to decide this case. And that was really the sum total of the involvement of the Supreme Court in the case. What was much more important was ultimately the case was brought to a federal district court judge sitting in Illinois, and he was the one who was really responsible more than anyone else for the outcome of the case.
And can you tell us exactly what that outcome was?
Yeah, well, the outcome was that the Skokie ordinances were struck down. The insurance requirement and all of that was struck down. And the judge in the case, a man named Bernard Decker, simply said that this was clearly a First Amendment issue. And he said he fully understood how obnoxious the ideas were, and he fully understood why people in Skokie, particularly the Holocaust survivors, were upset. But again, First Amendment, but if you don't mind, I'll just quote really briefly from what he said in the case, because I think this is a crucial part of the whole thing. He said the question is not whether there are some ideas that are completely unacceptable in a civilized society. And he clearly thought that the Nazi ideas were completely unacceptable. Rather, the question is, which danger is greater? The danger that allowing the government to punish unacceptable ideas will lead to suppression of ideas that are merely uncomfortable to those in power, or the danger that permitting free debate on such unacceptable ideas will encourage their acceptance rather than discouraging them by revealing their pernicious quality. And what he ended up concluding was there may be a danger that some people will be swayed by these ideas, but the greater danger is that the government will keep ideas out of the marketplace of ideas that it doesn't like. And we should add something. Maybe you want to hold this off to me for a little bit about what actually happened and what about the that which the party was ultimately allowed to do.
Yeah, I was going to ask that in a bit, so we'll get to that in just a
Okay.
second. Hang on to that. But Arnie, before we get to that, I do want to ask, I've kind of asked you about the reaction all along, but I do think it is really important to hear what this reaction was like upon hearing this kind of final decision. This is the end of it. How were people feeling? Was there some sort of relief of like, oh, it's kind of over at this point? Or was there more fear, more anger?
Well, they were going to be allowed, and again, it was March. That's all it was March that we were told it was going to be. It was the prevailing words, the Nazi, and that's how we remember it. It really depended who you asked. There was some anger. There were, as I said, there were people who couldn't wait for them to get there. The day they were supposed to come in. Now, and if you want to talk about what happened that day, before I say what their reaction was, I think that's really important.
Yeah, so I think so. Yeah, so if you want to hold on to that for
yeah,
one.
that's really where everything came to a boil.
Yeah. So Philippa, what ends up actually happening? Does this, we've talked about this kind of event that has been stalled. Does it end up ever actually happening? And what do the Nazis end up doing?
The ACLU, again with David Goldberger leading the charge, was simultaneously trying to get Chicago to back down so that the Nazis could demonstrate in Chicago, which is what they wanted to do in the first place. And if you remember, it was only because they were kept from doing that they sent a letter to all the local suburbs around. And there was a good deal of negotiating going on with Illinois itself. Some mediators from the federal government came in, and gradually an agreement was worked out where the Nazi Party could hold a demonstration on the Federal Plaza in Chicago. So they were going to be permitted to do that. They didn't have to post the bond ahead of time or any of those things. And ultimately, that is what happened. And it was a real, I mean, when I used to tell my students about this, I said it was a real victory for the whole notion of free speech and democracy, because there was this relatively small band, a couple of dozen of these scooseballs, if you will forgive me, within their uniforms. And there were masses of counter demonstrators out there clearly to show that they not only disagreed, but they were there to hurt these Nazis if they possibly could. So the Chicago police force was out in full force, kept everything relatively peaceful. And the Nazi party guys had to be escorted out without accomplishing anything, had to be escorted out of the demonstration site by the police so that they wouldn't be harmed, and they simply disappeared. So, it showed that counter demonstration and coming out to show how people object to really obnoxious ideas was very, very important in this case.
So
it went beyond that. Yeah, it went way beyond that. Well, as I recall, they were coming to Skokie when they got the deal, when they were pulling off the Edens Expressway and they were going to go up Oakton Avenue to where the Village Hall was. And that's, Philippa, correct me if I'm wrong, but weren't they like pulled over and said, hey, we've struck a deal, something like that?
Well, they were kept from getting anywhere in Skokie a little bit before this, but there was an injunction basically keeping them out. But and then the deal was struck in Chicago, and so they accepted that.
Right. When word came that they weren't coming, there was enormous cheers up, and I mean it was packed. There were, I don't remember, it must have been at least 1,000 people. It seemed like a sea of people in front of the village hall. Just, and as I say, some were just couldn't wait for them to get there. Others were, more peaceful. And when they said, nope, they've made a deal, people were cheering, people were applauding. It was like this enormous sense of relief had come over. It was over. It was done. And when they marched, when they were in the plaza, what was Federal Plaza, that's known as Daley Plaza. And just so people have a idea where it is, it's where the Picasso statue is, if you're familiar with that one. They were carrying giant plexiglass shields. They were like in a small circle with holding these shields up against them. People were flinging ice and rocks at them. It was, and yelling at them, and they didn't get a chance to say a word. They just, police, as you say, escorted them in, escorted them out, and that pretty much was the end of it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's clear that it really brought up a lot of different responses, which is, I think kind of different than the narrative that we hear. So it's really important to keep that. And also, I do think it's really important to point out the importance of counter demonstration as well. So thank you both for bringing that up. So I do want to know sort of what happens to the different players in this case after all this kind of dies down. Where does David Goldberger go? What happens to Frank Collin? Arnie, I know in our kind of previous discussions that you've talked about how some of these people even ran for office. So, if you could give us maybe the brief overview of what happens to each of the players in this case. I
can tell you about two. Collin ended up, it was discovered that his father was Jewish and had actually been held in one of the camps for 3 months, which people were wondering what is going on here. And he was arrested for child pornography, spent 4 years in prison.
More than pornography, Arnie. He was
that's
arrested
right, yeah.
for having sexual encounters with underage boys in the headquarters of the party.
Right. After he's released, he moved up to Wisconsin, changed his name, and he became a New Age guru. Believe it or not, and he edited a New Age magazine. I was looking the other day at Amazon. He had published a book on all kinds of things, including that dolphins are our ancestors. Very different second act of life. Now there's another guy. His name is Art Jones. He was part of that band. He became a perennial candidate in Chicago for, whatever, mayor or a senator or whatever. But a few years ago in Illinois 3rd District, this was 2018, I believe it was, he ran for Congress on the Republican ticket, this being Chicago. Democrats pretty much, rule the roost, and nobody ran against him. Nobody ran in the Republican primary. He was the only one who was in. People voted for them. And he won. He became the Republican candidate. It was one of those, oh my God moments. We've got a Nazi candidate in 2018. And he wasn't shy about saying who he was and what he stood for. What's really frightening is he got 25% of the vote in the final election. It was unsettling. And some people said, well, we didn't know what and I'm sure there were, people who just voted straight Republican who didn't realize, but it's not like there wasn't publicity about this guy. Now it was 2020, I believe. Yeah. When Marie Newman was running for Congress, and I went to one of her events, and Jones was also running in the Republican ticket. This time, of course, they got smart and they had somebody else going, but he stood outside with his merry band with signs talking about, Marie Newman, who ultimately won the election and served a term before we redistricted. But I remember him, they told us, don't engage, don't do anything with them. People were honking their horns, in solidarity with him. And when we got in, in the church where this, this event was being held, she said, let's address the elephant in the room here. And I stood up, I said, I remember Art Jones from the Skokie March, and he hasn't changed, and his views weren't welcome in Skokie, and his views aren't welcome here. was a powerful moment, but it
Yeah.
stayed. It didn't go away. The
Yeah.
ideas, anyway. To say they were mopes, but some still hung in there.
Yeah, yeah. And, I think we'll talk a bit more about that in just a second, but Philippa, can you tell us what happened to David Goldberger? What did he work on other cases for the ACLU? Kind of what, where is he now, I suppose?
David Goldberger eventually left Illinois. It was just, it had become untenable for him. There were death threats. He was very worried about his family. His parents had a horrible experience of hearing the rabbi in their synagogue castigate their son for defending Nazis, and the atmosphere was really rather horrible. And he eventually simply moved to Ohio, and that was it for a while. Still went on functioning as a lawyer, law professor. I mean, but sometimes doing the unpopular thing has really unpleasant consequences.
Yeah, thank you. So I do want to, before we get to audience questions, which we have a lot of, so I will try to get there as quickly as possible, but I do want to talk about, we're seeing an increase in hate speech, especially in the wake of Donald Trump's election, and just kind of all over the place. There's so much increase in hate speech. So does this, I'll direct this to you at first, Philippa, does this make us rethink the First Amendment protections, and how do we sort of approach hate speech now? And in your sort of legal opinion, what does that look like for us now? And how should we approach this decision, specifically this case?
Well, this decision was at a particular place, a particular time, and obviously the little Nazi party was not a real threat to anybody. I mean, nobody was going to go out and follow what they thought was necessary. Nobody was going to go attack Black people. No one was going to go out and attack Jews and say, you have to get out of here, whatever. And obviously, after January 6th, we have to think a little bit differently about that, which does not mean at all giving up on the First Amendment. The Supreme Court over the years has certainly found that there are limits to the free speech clause of the First Amendment. For example, there was something called the fighting words doctrine, which meant that you can't go up to somebody and say something totally obnoxious in that person's face and expect not to have consequences as a result. And so that kind of speech is questionable. Certainly what are called true threats, if you're making a threat to somebody, and even on the internet, for example, a true threat saying, I am going now to attack your house. I mean, this is actionable. So it's not as if we're without any tools, but I think what has happened over the last couple of decades is we've all had to think about how to utilize these tools in an age of internet speech, which certainly the people who wrote the First Amendment could not have contemplated. But I think many of us would argue that the verities behind the First Amendment remain true today. We don't want the government regulating speech. I mean, think of the Trump era. I myself would not want the Trump people to decide what I could or could not say in public. So we don't want the government, whoever's running it, to make those decisions. So how do we strike a balance then as societal factors change? That's something we all have to grapple with right now.
If I could add one thing too, Sydney, one of the end results of this whole thing was, as I said earlier, Holocaust education. Now we had it. And I think one of the single biggest end results of it was that Skokie opened a Holocaust museum.
Yes.
And it is a powerful place. I've been there many times. And they have a whole section too on the Skokie Nazi March. And I keep saying march because that's what it was, including some of the signs that were at the counter rally that I remember seeing those days. And also, if you remember, I talked about the little pamphlet I found in the street. There it was. There was a copy of it, which really hit home for me.
Yeah, and the Holocaust Museum that Arnie's talking about is the Illinois Holocaust Museum, who is our co-presenter for this program. So, so it all, you know, kind of ties together. So, well, I want to thank you both for that discussion, and I know we're kind of running low on time, so I'm going to try to get to some of our audience questions. So, I'm going to combine a few that have come in. Philippa, a lot of people are asking, how do you think the ACLU would handle this case today? Would they still take it on? And do you think that they, you know, what would the results be in terms of the ACLU kind of taking that on, and would they at all, I suppose?
Well, the ACLU still is taking on cases of that kind today. Absolutely. The First Amendment principle doesn't change. Again, there's a difference between speech and action. And when it is speech that the government is trying to prevent, yeah, I think the ACLU will always be there. So the answer to the question is yes, if it is just speech. Now, nobody's going to suggest that anybody come out in favor of the perpetrators of January 6th, for example, because we're talking about action. We're not talking about speech. But as long as it's just speech, and that, by the way, includes symbolic speech, which things like holding up signs is the kind of speech, according to Supreme Court doctrine. As long as it's just speech, yes, the principle hasn't changed, and neither will the ACLU reaction to it.
Thank you. So Arnie, I think this is a question that you can answer because you have been on our programs about other Nazi groups in the United States. So do you know if the National Socialist Party of America that was in Skokie, were they linked to other groups? And this attendee is specifically asking about the Long Island Nazis who we previous program, are they linked with?
Yeah, the German-American Bund, not the German-American Bund, which was the 1930s pro-Hitler movement, but they had a little space in Marquette Park, south side of Chicago. And just so people have context, Marquette Park was where Martin Luther King was hit by a brick when he was marching in Chicago in 1966. And he said, I never saw things in the South like I saw in Chicago. But they named it Rockwell Hall in honor of George Lincoln Rockwell, who was the American Socialist Party leader of the National Socialist Party of America leader in the 1960s, who was assassinated by one of his followers. And it was named Rockwell Hall in honor of our fallen leader. So they had more of a connection to that, but really it was just a bunch of guys who sat around in their little office and, you know, extolled Hitler.
Thank you. And yeah, and if you all want to learn more about these other groups, the museum does have programs about them, so I encourage you to check out our YouTube channel. So one question that we got that I think many people are probably wondering about, you know, we talked about how there was this use of the word march that was misused in this case. And Philippa, maybe you can tell us, why didn't anybody, you know, from the ACLU, or maybe they did, was there ever an attempt to kind of straighten out the record that this was not a march, that this was just a demonstration?
David Goldberger and others did try to talk in the Chicago area about that. Nobody paid very much attention. You know, it's that business of, okay, today I guess the analogy would be you see it on Fox News, it must be true. And then it was you read it in your local newspaper, it must be true. And so this, as I say, there wasn't very much anybody could do to practice. And I will say that scholars who have written about Skokie since have used the word march. And I, having taught about the Skokie case for years before I wrote the book about it, thought that this was it. And it wasn't until I got into the archives and saw the actual letter that the party had sent that I realized, no, they had never asked to have a march at all. So it just permeates everything. Once
It was
it's in
March.
the media, it's true.
It was March's, what we heard. It was always there was always the Nazis wanted to march.
Right.
And march is a pretty strong word too. I mean,
Yeah.
it conjures up Berlin.
Yeah. So then another question that came in, and this has been asked by a few different people in a few different ways, but were the Nazis in this case, were all of them Americans who were neo-Nazis, or were any of them, had they actually been in Germany? Was there any involvement from any former Nazis in this?
It's my understanding it was just a bunch of guys, American guys. Some might have had German background, but none of them were foreigners or anything like that, as far as I know anyway. They were, Americans. Colin's father was, of course, from Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And George Lincoln Rockwell, who was their hero, had served in World War II and I think Korea as well.
Thank you. And then, Arnie, because you had talked about education a bit earlier, we do have people wondering, is this now part of Holocaust education curriculum in Illinois? And, how does this affect, Holocaust education, I guess, nationwide as well?
Yeah, as I said, we took that test, and it wasn't a test, it was just, what do you guys know? It became part of Holocaust education. I can't speak if it's taught as part of it. I do know a couple years ago, my niece Rebecca, hi Rebecca, she's watching, had a list of history topics to interview people about, and there was the Skokie Nazi March on it. And I sat down with her and talked about it because it is now part of our history. It's
Mhm.
part of it's known, worldwide. So is it part of Holocaust education? I sure hope so. There's lessons to be learned about it, and particularly now that these guys look like such amateurs, like single A ball compared to the the major leagues that are going on out there.
So I think we have time for one or two more questions. So, besides your books, I would highly recommend both of Arnie's book about the German-American Bund and Philippa's book about this case specifically. But for either of you, besides your books, are there any other resources that you can recommend to learn about this case or about Nazis in the United States? And also, Philippa, I'm going to add on free speech and how the First Amendment kind of operates. I know it's kind of a big topic, but if you have maybe like one or two books.
The Skokie Library has a complete repository and some things online too. I would strongly recommend going there first.
Mm-hmm.
And as far as free speech goes, I would direct people to the ACLU website, which is really good on free speech. And there are a lot of books out there, but different levels. A lot of them are law books. I don't know that that's what we're looking for here, but I would start with that website.
Thank you. And so I think I want to end with a question of my own. So I'm sorry, I know we have a lot of questions from people, but I do think that this is important to get to. What do you think is the most important thing? If you had to have one takeaway from learning this case in this time that we are in now, what do you hope people take away from learning about this case in this event? And I know it's a big question, so take all the time you need.
I have a quick answer, and
Sure.
that is free speech is the underpinning of democracy, and we have to defend it whenever it is threatened.
Mm-hmm.
How's that for a quick line takeaway?
That's good.
And the difference between Nazis in 1933, 1934, and the Jews from 1933, 1934, we didn't have the right to talk back. We didn't have the right to speak back. And that in part is why the Nazis failed in their attempt to march. I'm going to use that word, march in Skokie, because we had the right to speak back, and we did. And people were loud and proud about it too.
Well, I want to thank you both so much for this discussion. I know that this is such a big topic and a really complicated one as well. So thank you so much for this really interesting discussion, and for both of you, sharing your knowledge with us. And, I'd really encourage all of you who are joining us today to do more research about this. It is a really fascinating and important case to learn about, especially in this current time. So if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum at mjhnyc.org/support and joining us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events.